Are you struggling to balance your modern life and your faith? You're in the right place. Welcome to the Legacy Dads Podcast with Lance and Dante, offering biblical-based wisdom and that weekly dose of what truly works in men's lives. The Legacy Dads Podcast, real men, authentic faith. Here are your hosts of the Legacy Dads Podcast. They're authentic, transparent, and not always politically correct. Lance and Dante.
Hey everyone, this is Dante, my partner Lance. Lance, how are you in day 1954 of COVID quarantine?
I'm hanging in here. I need a haircut, but
you're not trained to do that on your own. I mean, Sear doesn't give you how to cut your hair and use it for like
it would be it would be ugly. It'd be very ugly.
Jen, you can't get Jen to help you along, you know?
She likes it. She's like, I like your hair long. You should just keep growing it out. I'm like, okay. I'm gonna have a man bun pretty soon, and no, I'll never have a man bun.
Ponytail and a ZZ Top beard when you're on the highway.
Yeah,
get out of the way. Well, let's get some of business out of the way. Legacy Dads is your weekly dose of biblical manhood. This podcast is for men, husbands, and fathers in all stages of life, where we promote and advocate proven biblical principles for leaving a lasting legacy. You know, Lance, I'll tell our listeners here, you turned me on to a lot of really good books from leadership, social networking, discipleship, parenting, and such. This book that we're about to discuss in today's podcast is about 3 trends that are hurting our children. And the book is called The Coddling of the American Mind by Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt. This is based on 3 bad ideas in the book. In other words, it's about 3 great untruths that seem to have spread widely in today's culture. The untruth of fragility, what doesn't kill you makes you weaker. The untruth of emotional reasoning, always trust your feelings. And the third untruth of us versus them. Life is a battle between good and evil people. In this podcast, Lance and I will hope to show you how these 3 truths and policies related to these, along with political movements, are having major impacts on people, on universities, and to be more specific, individuals. To name just a few of these problems you may relate to or you may see in your very own backyard, teen anxiety, depression, and suicide rates have been risen sharply in the last few years. The culture on many college campuses has become more ideologically uniform, compromising the ability of scholars to seek truth and students to learn from a broad range of thinkers, even thinkers that disagree with their own beliefs. Extremists have proliferated on the far right and the far left, provoking one another to even deeper levels of hatred. Social media has channeled partisan passions into the creation of call-out culture. Anyone can be publicly shamed for saying something well-intentioned that someone else interprets uncharitably. New media platforms and outlets allow citizens to retreat into self-confirmatory bubbles where their worst fears about the evils of the other side can be confirmed and amplified by extremists and cyber trolls intent on sowing discord and division. From memes to just downright nastiness, even some of my fellow brothers and sister Christians are just downright over the top. And Lance, with that, let's get started here. Walk us through your mind and share with our listeners some of your thought processes here.
Yeah. So Dante, I'll say this is that, I think when I look at this, parents, when I did parenting conferences and a lot of parents ask us, what's the one thing? That I really, and I think this is going to be this podcast, guys, and the next podcast. This is something that you absolutely have to get. If this would be one of those things, I think it would be up there with, ensuring your kids, you pass on faith to your kids. But this would be one of those, these podcasts. It's like, you need to get this right. You need to understand this, because I see this as just one of the, this is one of the things that is tearing down our society right now. So I will tell you, Dante, just getting into this thing, like historically, and we're going to look at talking from a college campus. This is kind of, the end results where, we always talk about on Legacy Dads is you're looking at when I raise my kids and when I send them out into college or the world or the workforce or the military or vocational, whatever you're going to do. what is the fruits of my parenting labors, if you will. And so, Dante, historically, students within the college environment have, they've stood up for free speech. And I want to say, I hate to give to give UC Berkeley credit, but the free speech students back in the 60s, on UC Berkeley were like, no, we want free speech. There must be free speech. But now today we're seeing the opposite. You're seeing students on campuses rallying for censorship. And and some of the crazy things that you're seeing is that they're justifying increased campus censorship with medical conditions. You got students that are claiming that encountering certain kinds of content is impairing their ability to function. And many students today claim that hearing something that's counter to their opinion is emotionally, psychologically, and even physically harmful. Okay, so this to me, I mean, for those of us that are older, this may sound crazy, but we want to give you guys an idea of what this is and what we're dealing with.
And to add to that, Lance, not to cut you off here, but to the level and the degree, and we're not just talking one side party. We're talking extreme left, extreme right, and no in between, because it is so polar opposite. And it's all the stuff in the middle that is just inciting it even further down that proverbial rabbit hole. And to the point now where both sides are sitting there literally saying, not only do we want censorship, we will use violence and intimidation and or just downright interruption of somebody's political thoughts and shouting over at the top of them, just awful and hateful and spiteful things that you can't even let somebody else that has a difference of opinion have their constitutional right of freedom of speech. This is how serious what we're talking about going on here.
Yeah, and it's we're going to delve into this. It's not just a political thing, but this is a serious psychological issue with kids these days. And it's easy, for us old timers, it's really easy to say, well, it's because these kids have it so easy and all that. But I will tell you, and I know you know this, Dante, because you've got teenagers in the house. Kids today, this is what our culture has set up. Kids today are competing for places at selective college. They're now competing on a global level. So it's not just, it used to be if you went to state college, you're competing with people inside your state. Now you're competing with kids from all over the world who are superior academically, trying to get into these colleges as well. And so kids today, especially teenagers, are under enormous pressure to perform academically. And it's not just about academics. Colleges now want to see you have to be involved in all these extracurriculars and sports, and you have to be this well-rounded person. It's not just the 4.0 or that's going to get you into college anymore. And then on top of that, we're seeing that teens are facing new forms of harassment that we never dealt with. And that's coming from, social media and all sorts of other avenues that we really didn't deal with when we were, we were their age. And then on top of that, Dante, you know this well, that even if you go and you do what you're told to do, go get a 4-year degree, when you come out of there, the economic prospects are uncertain in this economy because we're being shaped by globalism, automation, artificial intelligence, wage stagnation, just a lot of things. So to just say that, I think that kids aren't being pampered. It's not that, they're being pampered and overly, they are working hard. I see this. I saw my kids struggle and work hard. But I think the issue is it's a culture of what the authors call safetyism. And, we did a talk on this, Dante, a long time ago about, overprotective or helicopter parenting. And this culture of safetyism has been perpetuated in our society, and it's actually teaching our children to adopt negative mental health states called cognitive distortions. So what we're doing, and this is, I don't want to name people out, but there's, well-intentioned parents, well-intentioned school officials, well-intentioned academics and everybody that are just uninformed, and they're actually causing mental harm to our children. Now, to frame this for you guys, to give you a definition. So a cognitive distortion is essentially, it's an irrational thought pattern involved in the onset of a psychological state. So, my wife deals with this all the time, where you're trying to correct people's bad mental health. And these cognitive distortions are a part of that. So you, like I said, you have some parents, schools, institutions that are actually, rather than, countering these things, they're teaching their kids and reinforcing these unhealthy psychological patterns. And like you said, Dante, in the past 10 years, psychologists and mental health professionals like my wife, they're seeing, mental health issues in children double and almost triple in especially in the areas of like anxiety and depression and suicide.
And fear. And the sad part about the fear is even fear of the unknown.
Yeah.
And so you're getting into extremities where like the idea of even trying to function in either a highly stressed career or something along that line, or just, in just being a productive, healthy, normal citizen is being interrupted because of the extreme. And, what started out as maybe this is a way of thinking now has just become indoctrination, and it's just not healthy. And we're seeing the results or the fruit of this, that it's having reverse consequences from whatever the original intent was.
Yeah. And we talked about this, Dante, in one of the podcasts we did on overprotective parenting. But, when I first wrote about this 15 years ago, people said I was crazy. People were, calling me out, moms and dads and parents, and people were saying, you're out of your mind. Like what do you think we should just let our kids go out and let them deal with the real world? You're out of your mind. We have to protect these kids. Like we talked about in a previous podcast, now 15 years later, research is now coming out saying this was probably one of the worst things we have done to our kids in the last 20 years. And what you're saying, Dante, is, as a parent, we can change a lot faster than institutions and things can. And we're seeing that this culture of safetyism that's been, kind of brought up in the last 20 years. Now you're seeing institutional practices, mainly in schools and universities and organizations, that are overreaching their goals, and they're actually of protecting children from harm, and they're actually causing harm. So, long story short here, as parents, what we want is, one, we want you to be aware of this so that you are not causing unintentional harm to your children by reinforcing these things. And we also want to make sure that you're aware of this issue that's happening in our society, because you and your children, you're going to see it, you're going to have to deal with it. And by the end of this podcast, you're going to be like, I've seen this, I know this, I see this every single day. You're going to know people that are just, their whole lives are, this cognitive distortion is who they are as a person. It's kind of scary. But that's kind of the goal, Dante. That's where my thinking is I really want to help parents get a grasp on this and understand this thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I want to put the caveat on exactly what you're talking to, and you've used it before, and we've talked about it before in previous podcasts too, is this whole notion of critical thinking. So as you're listening to this, as we're going through that, we want you to put on your critical thinking caps. We want you to look at things, on all different specters and see what the long-term, prospect is. If you find yourself caught up in, yeah, I got to own that. Yeah, I'm doing that. Yeah, my family's exuding this, is okay. Now what? Identify, the first, part of like realizing there's a problem in recovery is, one, admitting I have a problem. After I admit I have a problem, okay, now let's take the next step. And the idea is not to shame, not to make you feel bad, not to do anything, but it was just saying, if we're really, legacy dads, and we're really trying to take this to the level that we want to take it to, and what are we doing here, then we've got to, clean house. And that starts with the top, and that's the spiritual leadership that we're supposed to be stepping into. So dads, grandfathers, moms, whoever's listening to this podcast, open your ears, ask for, critical thinking and discernment, and start taking notes and things that apply. Resources, book will be given. We'll put that up with the podcast here. But honestly, let's go into this. So Lance, first untruth, the untruth of fragility. What doesn't kill you makes you weaker.
Yeah, so this untruth basically teaches our children that they need to avoid. We need to avoid unpleasant, uncomfortable, or anything that's inconvenient. And to me, this accomplishes precisely the opposite of what real learning should do. It's basically, we've talked about this before with, again, my fellow Christian parents out there. some of us adopt this model that we are so afraid of the world. We are so fearful of sin that we try to create this, Christian bubble around our homes and around our children so that, the thinking is if no sin ever touches my child, that they're going to, go out into the world sin free. But I mean, that is a lie from the pit of hell. I don't care, what you do, you can't keep sin out of your home. And what you're doing by trying to perpetuate this idea is you're actually making your children unprepared for what they're going to face in the real world. Because, in life, we're going to face completely unexpected events. We're going to face things that are adversity. We're going to face things that were not expected. And rather than, trying to create this environment, this completely safe environment where kids never see or have to deal with this stuff, what we should be doing is looking at ways of how do we create environments that allow our kids to understand this and then have the grit and adversity to overcome these things. I will tell you, Dante, and I will post it up on our Facebook page so guys can look at this. They're David Axelrod and Van Jones, two very, very liberal Democratic commentators that I don't agree with the majority of things they said. But Van Jones did an actual. They interviewed him and asked him about this, and I think I 100% I agree with him with his reply. And one of the things he said is, we as parents, we're not going to pave the jungle for our children. Our children need to learn to put on their boots and how to navigate the jungle. And I think a lot of parents, what their approach has been is, rather than teaching my kids how to navigate the jungle, I want to pave the jungle and make it easy for them, or keep the jungle away from them. So that's some of the stuff we're seeing. And I'll tell you, one of the things that I see in this idea of, the world is unsafe and we need to be afraid of the world. And we need to be afraid of everything. There's 3 cognitive distortions. And these are, for those of you that aren't familiar with the psychological world, so they're basically, DSM, psychological conditions that if you work in the mental health industry or the psychological industry, if somebody's thinking this way, it's something that says, okay, this is a problem. They're having, incorrect psychological thoughts, and we need to counter this. So the first one is catastrophizing. Catastrophizing is basically focusing on the worst possible outcome and seeing it as most likely. Dante, we just saw this with the COVID-19 thing. People, media outlets, politicians, they basically said, like, this is the end of the world. Let's focus on the worst possible thing that could happen, and let's perpetuate that and just tell people to be fearful and live in fear and get overexcited and agitated about that. The second thing is overgeneralizing, perceiving a certain global pattern of negatives based on a single incident. Saying, if something bad happens, well, this always happens to me, or, this is, I seem to fail all the times. It's overgeneralizing. And I've seen this, we're going to talk a little bit about this later too, where you can do this with groups, where if one person acts in a certain way, you're going to overgeneralize that entire group of people is the same as that person. And then the third is negative filtering. And this focuses almost exclusively, again, on the negatives, seldomly noticing the positives. And
you're describing mainstream media right now, or what are you doing here?
No, I mean, so I think you can have this even with parenting. So yeah. For example, if I'm a Christian and I'm so fearful of the world, and I just see that I can't let my kids, we need to go and live off grid somewhere where, nobody can ever find us because the world is so sinful and so bad. And we totally, and that's just focusing on the negatives. And there's bad things in the world. There's dangerous things in the world. There's things that can cause our kids harm. But if we go back to a biblical lens, what did God call us to do? God called us to engage the world. God called us to bring the gospel to all nations. So when we're focusing on the negative, we're throwing out the baby with the bathwater. We're throwing out the Great Commission and what God has called us to do as parents. So, I think as parents, we need to counter this narrative, and we need to allow our children to wrestle with discomfort and allow them to explore other ideas and other points of view. and allow them, this is a big one, moms, allow them to face the natural consequences when they arise. Don't run in and rescue your child every time they have a conflict or discomfort or they get in trouble. Now, we're not saying you don't just throw them to the wolves, but also don't try to create an environment where they don't have to face any adversity. I've talked about it previously in Paul Tufts' book, How Children Succeed. Paul Tufts' research shows that the happiest children, the ones with the best mental health, and the children that are most prepared for college and the real life are the ones that have experienced adversity and they learned coping mechanisms, or what we would just call grit, in order to deal with that adversity. Does that make sense to you, Dante?
Yeah. Okay. Do you have a definition for grit? I remember the book talking about that, but
I really don't. But I think
misunderstood or no perseverance without passion is mere drudgery. So grit, describing that as being misunderstood with no perseverance, and that the idea is that you're gonna go through this, and you're gonna take perseverance, you're gonna take the struggles, and you're gonna have it, because that gives you ownership, and that gives you the ability to overcome these things that, if you don't, will cause you stresses or will cause you different anxieties per se, if they're not dealt with appropriately, or coming to a normal cognitive mentality. One of the things that I really liked about the book was, given the victim of our technology and COVID, what is a natural response? We're all locked in. Oh my goodness, don't go near your neighbor, stay within 6 feet of social distancing, and it's the end of the world. And so we're allowing our kids to get more and more enveloped in technology, iPhone, smart. There comes a point, parents, where we just got to say, hey, screen time, 2 hours, get outside and exercise the body. I don't care what you do, stay with brother or sister, sibling, but move the body, move the joints, overcome some of your fears, and at least walk within the perimeter of your yard if you don't want them to go across the street. But you got to get them moving.
Yeah, and Dante, we've talked about this before. Go look in your Bible and read how many times God tells us to fear not.
Yes.
And that's, I don't see anywhere in the Bible where God says, fear the world, fear sin, fear everything. What we need to do as Christians is lock ourselves in rooms and fear everything and just read the Bible. I don't see that. I see throughout the Bible, God telling us, fear not. If you have faith in me, I will get you through this. And I think that's something that as parents, we have to remember to teach our kids that yes, you're going to face adversity. Yes, you're going to face things. There's going to be times in your life.
Yeah,
that's where you call on God, and God's going to get you through it.
And the thing about it is modeling that. I mean, John 16, you were going right there, Lance, is, Jesus talking to his disciples. I have said these things to you in figures of speech. The hour is coming when I will no longer speak to you in figures of speech, but will tell you plainly about the Father. And that day you will ask in my name. And I do not say to you that I will ask the Father on your behalf, for the Father himself loves you, because you have loved me and have believed that I come from God. I came from the Father and have come into the world, and now I'm leaving the world and going to the Father. His disciples said, now you are speaking plainly and not using figurative speech. Now we know that you know all things and do not need anyone to question you. That is why we believe that you came from God. And this is important, listener. Jesus answered them, and he said, do you now believe? Behold, the hour is coming indeed. It has come when you will be scattered, each to his own home, and will leave me alone. Yet I am not alone, for the Father is with me. I have said these things to you, that in me you have peace. In the world you will have tribulation. But take heart, I have overcome the world.
Yeah. Yep. And I think that's a great summary of this first one here, is that, just not living in this idea, the fragility, or that the world is such an evil place and everything is, we need to be fearful of it.
So taking us to untruth number 2, the untruth of emotional reasoning. Always trust your feelings.
Yeah, and this is, again, don't take this to extremes. So I think it's when you rely solely on your feelings. I think it's especially dangerous, given that we know the makeup of the human psyche. We know that. And if you don't know this about yourself, we as people, we're rife with biases and these cognitive distortions. If you want, go read a book called by Daniel, what's his name? Daniel Kahneman, I think is who writes it, called Thinking Fast and Slow. Best-selling book talking about how we have these, biases and cognitive distortions with this. And it's up to us to realize when we're having those and to have critical thinking again. We're talking about Dante. And it's amazing to me, we were talking about this last night, on the phone. It's amazing to me how many people, once you realize what this is, how many people that you talk to in person and on social media have blatant biases, including, confirmation bias, which confirmation bias is essentially choosing to only see or read or consider opinions that match your own. And they don't even, a lot of people don't even realize that they're bias conditioned. So, I think that we always say, that you got to trust your gut. I think there's times to trust your gut. And I think there's times, there's a great book, what is it called?
Yeah, but not to cut you off, but trusting your gut is a lot different than trusting your feelings.
The feelings, yeah, that's what I'm saying. Okay, the book's called The Gift of Fear, and in The Gift of Fear, they talk about, again, these are fight or flight, these are life and death, physical harm situations where people's gut kind of told them, you need to get out of this situation right now. I think that's different than, again, trusting your emotions. Well, I feel bad today, so I know if I go outside the house, I'm going to, everything's going to irritate me. I'm in an emotional state that I'm probably not, going to deal with people the best way I can. So I think we pay attention to our emotions, Dante, but going back to this critical thinking, we need to seek to ground them in reality. And we need to realize if we're being emotional and our emotions are based on unrealistic expectations or based on something that's totally not reality. So here's a perfect example. I don't know if you ever had this happen. Has your wife ever been mad at you for something you did in her dream?
Do you want her to come down here and talk to you?
And I was like, I love my wife, right? But I'm like, honey, you're mad at me for something that I did in your dream.
Yeah. Did you tell her, can you analyze that one for me, please?
So, I was like, okay, honey, I understand your feelings and emotions here, but they're not grounded in reality. So, I think that's what I'm trying to say, Dante, is we got to check, our emotions, our gut feeling, all that stuff's important, but it has to perceive it against the thoughts and feelings, most difficultly truth and reality. And I would say it from a biblical perspective against a biblical lens. Does that make sense?
And look at it, in the most innocent of form of if this is going to be a truth and you're going to believe this, let's look at it in an innocent form. A little child, playing with another child or getting mad at mom or dad because they take something away or they tell them to stop doing something. What does the child say? They feel like you're being unfair. I hate you. I don't love you anymore. And they walk away. And, if we're going to sit there and believe that they trust their feelings or we trust their feelings, that's reality, then why is it that they come back next day and it's like nothing ever happened? What about, to the most extreme dangers, you put yourself in an improper friendship of the opposite sex. And all of a sudden, Lance wakes up, Jen's mad at him in a dream. He doesn't need this because he's got enough stress at work. He goes to work and there's a female colleague. And the next thing he says, you know what? I don't feel like I love Jen anymore. I feel like I love this other woman because, she's affirming me and what I'm doing and where I'm at right now. And so do you see the dangers? I mean, like Lance, you're saying that, and ultimately you and Jen got to a point where, hey, this is a dream. Yes, I know you're mad at me, but let's work through this and let's talk about common sense things here. We process through that, but it doesn't define reality. And that's the danger, is if we always trust our feelings, age, circumstance, experience, a lot of different factors change the way that our feelings result into the end. And if we allow them to always dictate to us a correct course of action, how dangerous and immature and lack of critical thought is that taking to believe in that untruth?
Yeah. And in the book, the authors really get into this thing called, microaggressions. And, I won't get into it extensively on here, but I mean, the idea with microaggressions for the longest time, and I think most of us that are rational understand this, if somebody says something to me, you have to look at, and this is even in a court of law and in legal proceedings, we look at intent. Is that person intending to be malicious? Are they intending to say something, maybe racist, or are they intending to slight me? Or was it just a simple mistake? Was it an accident? And I love the authors bring up, when you're dealing with different cultures, people that maybe English is not their first language, or you're dealing with people that have things like autism, they're just socially awkward, and they're sometimes going to say things off color. And, and what the idea of microaggressions is it's not the intent, it's how I perceive you. So if I perceive what you said as hurtful to me, then you're wrong, regardless of whether you intended to do that or not. So it basically says there's no more accidents. There's no more, hey, this person, is just not a native language speaker. It's basically, if you say anything that I believe is offensive, you're in the wrong. And it goes back to, what we're talking about here is my feelings matter more than, rational thought and critical thinking.
And the truth.
Yeah.
Right. And can we see how dangerous that gets if all of a sudden we allow our emotions and our feelings to rule us? God gave us emotions for different things, but certainly not for, making unwise decisions, and certainly not letting them dictate how we should do that. It depends on the time. If it's high stress, danger, all these different things, adrenaline is given to us, but the way that, feelings come across sometimes help us through those situations. But certainly I don't allow those situations to rule, my decision or my thought process, because if I get into a situation where I'm honking angry and I allow my anger to make my decisions, there's going to be some things that I say and things that I do that if I allow that to happen, I'm never going to be able to take back in a rational world. And that's where the danger is. And I'm just saying, to buy this, that you always trust your feelings, woe to the untruth on this and how dangerous that is.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So,
Dante.
that brings us to our final point and untruth number 3. And the untruth is us versus them. Life is a battle between good and evil people.
Yeah. And this is, that this life is a battle between good and evil. I think the crazy part about this is we're always the good people, of course. So when we use this cognitive distortion, it's always, well, I'm part of the good people and you are a part of the evil people.
Yeah.
And,
we have the moral high ground.
Yeah. So we see that, it's funny. When you learn about this stuff, it's very interesting because you can analyze your friends, especially on social media, and you can see this played out very well. And I think we see this played out in the traditional news media and on social media. Politicians and news outlets are very savvy on this, and this is something they try to use to divide people. And I think we see this, Dante, especially in the last 10, 15 years. This cognitive distortion is very prevalent in our society, where we group people either into being, they're either privileged, or they're oppressed. Okay. And so we automatically say, if you look a certain way or you come from a certain background, I'm going to say you're either privileged or oppressed. Okay. Yep. You're good or you're bad. If you're in this political party, you're good. If you're not in that political party, you're bad. Okay. And, when I was thinking about this totally goes against, arguably the greatest civil rights movement of all time with Martin Luther King. The idea, Martin Luther King said that we need to judge people based on the content of their character, not the color of their skin. But instead, how far have we come from Martin Luther King's time? Instead, what we're doing now with this cognitive distortion is we're grouping people into groups based on this cognitive distortion. So we're saying, okay, if you're white, you have privilege. If you're an African American, you're oppressed. Okay. If that's saying that you're saying I have more privilege than Barack Obama or Oprah, I don't think so. But I think it's easy for us. We can look.
he's playing golf when the golf courses are closed in Virginia. I mean, he's got a little bit more privilege than you do, buddy.
No, but I think what it is, and again, you put this in, I'm using the African American white as an example. And I think, don't get me wrong. And we've said this in numerous podcasts. Do we believe that there's oppression? Do we believe there's racism? Yes, there is. But you can't just automatically group somebody into a category by looking at them. And so I think what you have to do is, rather than looking at a person, you have to look at, what is that person's background? Again, we talked about this. What's the backstory? What is their individual circumstances? Because we can't just group anyone from this category into the cognitive distortion, or we're going right into this. So when people give into this cognitive distortion, they tend to view anyone that's not me in the category of evil.
If you don't agree with me.
If you don't agree with me. Yeah.
You're on the opposite side of what I'm used to. You're evil.
Yeah. And it creates this division in our culture of us versus them. And the crazy thing, and what we've seen in recent years, and this has got even more expounded, is when it becomes us versus them, anything goes. And the ends always justifies the means, to slander or to hurt that person, or even physical violence against people, because we just perceive them as being in the other category. And I'm gonna, I'll call it out right now, because this is something in the news cycle right now. So we saw people vilify someone like Brett Kavanaugh when he was accused of sexual assault, but then the same people are totally dismissing it when Joe Biden is accused of the exact same thing, because they are in, if that person, Joe Biden's in your good people group, then we will justify unethical and even illegal activities. And to me, that's hypocrisy. To me, if somebody did something, yeah, there's due process, and we give, the person the benefit of the doubt in the court of law, but we don't automatically discount and say, well, it's fine if that person did it because that's my political, candidate. And I've argued this with my friends on social media. I'm like, you need to just, if something's wrong, and as Christians, if it's sinful, if it's wrong, if it's unethical and it's immoral, I don't care who it is, you need to call it out and say, yeah, that person, that may be my political party, but if that person did that, I don't stand with that person. That's wrong, and they need to be held accountable for that.
I agree. I mean, you're right. Due process, a person is presumed innocent until proven guilty. So just as, a vice president that's now being accused, as you say, Brett Kavanaugh, they had to, literally, they should have come in and been presumed innocent, and then hear all the merits of the case, all the testimony, all the timeline, all the facts, and let the facts line up where they line up, and let a court of law, or in some cases, depending on what venue it is, public opinion, decide from there. But when you already, based on, like you're saying, privilege or unprivileged, and oppressed, right away you're automatically classifying somebody. And for me to broad brush Lance just based on color, I think that gets us into a very dangerous, unexplainable situation. Likewise, same thing depending on where somebody goes. I mean, some of the smartest people that I've ever met and talked to have been more well-read and well-versed and understanding, and make pittance compared to an average line person, in a manufacturing company. But for them, that doesn't matter. What matters is that they're content with what station God has given them in their life. And I have more respect for a person like that than a person that's, in the 1% that, wants more and more and more and doesn't care who he steps on to get there. And not to sit there and say people that are in that position don't have morals, don't have grit, and don't have understanding of good character like you're talking about. It's to be rather than to seem. And I think in the reality of here, we have to measure that in the importance of that. You just can't broad brush into good and evil, Lance, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. And I think, and that's the scary thing with this cognitive distortion is especially concerning, because we've seen a lot of violence recently against people because of this. And, on both sides. Yeah. And in the book, the authors highlight, they use multiple examples, but some of the examples they use is multiple, these are liberal Democratic college professors who were vilified, forced to resign, and some even physically attacked by students, even though the students are are the same political and they're aligned together. They're Democratic, they're liberal students who are politically and ideologically aligned with these professors. But for whatever reason, these professors were put into the evil category and people lashed out at them. One of the statistics, Dante, in this book that really scared me was that people, they said it was a very low number of people that said that they would use violence against somebody they perceived as being in the evil group. But the other statistic they said, but 30 to 40% of them said they thought it was fine if somebody else did violence against those people. And that to me is a little bit scary. And I think what you talked about too, Dante, with the spread of social media and cable news right now, anyone can very quickly be put into that evil category and their lives can be ruined without any due process or any proof, of accusation. And in the book, they talked about that. I mean, these are liberal Democratic college professors from very liberal universities, and the students just turned on them and started calling them racist and all, and basically, eating their own people, if you will.
And that's a product by how they were indoctrinated. That therein lies the danger right there, Lance.
Yeah. We talked about this in the, back in, I think it was 2017, the students at Evergreen State College, took over the university for a couple of weeks and they were just, berating and physically and emotionally and psychologically just abusing staff and the president of the college and all this type of stuff. And one of the students said, "You taught us to do this. You taught us to act like this. You taught us to use violence against those that we don't see in the same group as us." And it was very telling of that. So, as a parent, how do we counter this? And I think we counter this by teaching our kids empathy and teaching them that just because somebody doesn't look or sound or talk like you doesn't mean that they're evil. And that we have to look at people's actions and the content of their character and intent before we decide where you group these people. And I think we also do this by exposing our kids to different points of view and cultures, exposing them to foreigners, to people that may be outside of their normal homogenous group. And then what we have to do, I think, Dante, is teach them to try to understand others from where they're at rather than quickly labeling them. So if somebody says something that's totally counter to your beliefs, try to seek to understand. I'm not saying you have to jump on their bandwagon and believe what they believe, but at least empathize and try to understand why are you coming from this point of view and why are you thinking that way versus just saying you're evil, you're against me, you're in the other category. Does that make sense to you, Dante?
Yeah. And even if they disagree with you, they have a different thought process. They're from a different culture. They're from a different land. Is the idea that, that's what really defines, culture, is that you have this melting pot. I mean, like our founding fathers, come through as immigrants and they built, one of the greatest nations that we've ever seen. And the idea was not to suppress thoughts, not to suppress, that I'm different than somebody else, but that inherently we all have the same rights and that we're all created by God. And thereby, if we're all created by a God, we all have inherent rights, then we should have the same freedoms. We should have the same ideas. And the idea is not to be threatened by somebody, like you said, the intent. If somebody's there and they're evil and they're trying to hurt me, that's a much different conversation than what we're talking about right here. Yes. And that's the idea, is that when you put that in perspective of, even if somebody is politically opposed to me, I have very good friends that, ideologically, politically, and every other curve are opposite, and we'll get to a point where we'll, look at each other and laugh, or just, in humble disgust, jokingly, I say that with tongue in cheek, but get to the point where, like, okay, at this point, we're just going to agree to disagree, move on. And the idea is we love each other too much to let something that like this get in the way of our friendship and love for one another and respect. And that's the idea, is when you get into this perspective, the minute that you start classifying it, that's where hate is born, is ignorance. And ignorance turns into a whole different thing. And just putting this in perspective of, okay, I have to give everybody the fair handshake, and I have to do that. Is there evil in the world? Yes. Do we have to guard against evil? Do we have to stand up against evil? Absolutely. But, you have to put yourself into situations, not be afraid of risk, and wonder, okay, how do we get to there? And it's not buying into, these three untruths, is taking to the next step. And, with that, Lance, let's wrap this up here, but, give you a couple final thoughts, but just summarizing and so far what we discussed, and looking at the authors of this book, calls on universities and colleges and administrators to identify with freedom of inquiry by endorsing basically the Chicago principles of free speech. The Chicago principles are a set of guiding principles intended to demonstrate a commitment to freedom of speech and freedom of expression on college campuses in the United States. So basically, since 2014, as a result of this book and thought and comments that have come through that, several other universities have committed to these principles, including Princeton University, Purdue University in Indiana, and Washington University in St. Louis. So it's nice to know that rational cognitive thought is coming together and saying, no, this is really important. With that, Lance, give us your final closing thoughts here.
Yeah, so I invite you guys, stay tuned. The next week's podcast, we're gonna delve into this a little bit more too, and we're gonna talk about this from what do we do as parents, and how do we do this, and I'll say why is this happening, and what we've seen is increased political polarization since the 1980s. We talked about rising rates of anxiety and depression and suicide among American adults over the past decade. The emergence and the intensification of this overprotective or this safetyism amongst parents, and a decline in unsupervised free play among children since the 1980s. Something we'll talk about that next podcast is the difference between our generation and the younger generations when they were allowed to actually go outside and play. And then we've also seen bureaucratic expansion and incorporation of the educational system, particularly at the college level, and then a shift in how social justice is conceptualized from a focus on what you were just talking about, Dante, equality and proportionality and the promotion of equal opportunity, to a focus on equality of outcome, which is totally something different, which we'll get about in this next podcast. So guys, stay tuned. And again, I know this is kind of long-winded, but it's very important stuff. And I think it's something, if you can understand this, it will radically change not only you, but the way you parent and the way you interact with the world. So as always, guys, we want to say we thank you guys so much. We thank you for your support. Head over to iTunes, Spotify, or Pandora. Leave us a great 5-star review. You can check us out on Instagram and also on the closed Facebook group. And I'm going to post up that video again. I think it says a lot when I'm posting something from David Axelrod and Van Jones about not seeing them as the evil in the other category, but it's a great video, and I'll post that up so you guys can see that. So take a look at that, guys. Stay tuned. We love you guys. We were praying for you guys. Take care, and God bless.
God bless.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Legacy Dads Podcast with Lance and Dante. Real men, authentic faith. For more great content and to stay up to date, visit legacydads.org and on Facebook.com/LegacyDads and on Twitter @Legacy_Dad. If you enjoyed today's episode, please review and subscribe, and we'll catch you next time on the Legacy Dads Podcast. Real men, authentic faith.